the Medical AI Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Medical AI Podcast, a 30-minute thrill ride of big ideas. We are Dr. Felix Beecher and Joe McKeating, and we talk to a range of top guests from scientists to industry innovators to philosophers. Imagine having crippling back pain, but there's a 4-month waiting list for a physiotherapist. Alternatively, you may have instant access to an AI-based physiotherapy system. Now, 80% of adults have significant back pain at some point, so there's an excellent chance that this kind of choice is one that you will have to make. But can it be made to work? Is the technology ready? Would it be accepted by governments and patients? With me is Finn Stevenson, who is working on precisely this idea. He is a former medic and CEO of Flok Health. Finn, a very, very big welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Felix. Great to be here.
Great. So, look, why don't we start with telling us about where the idea for Flok came from originally?
Sure, yeah. So my background is I studied medicine. After medical school, I did my postgrad in musculoskeletal science, specifically looking at spine conditions, basically. I then took a slightly unorthodox route, and rather than going into clinical training and practice and becoming a doctor, I actually spent 3 years as a full-time athlete on a rowing program. So I was training for, trying to be selected for the Olympics. I wasn't good enough to go to the Olympics, but did get to the level where I had the opportunity to train in a well-resourced full-time environment, part of which meant having continuous access to healthcare, including physiotherapy for musculoskeletal pain, for injuries. And then fast forward a few years when I left that environment, left rowing, and was working when I worked in medical devices, medical technology, for surgical robotics specifically, and suddenly it was more of a normal life, I guess, and my back flared up again, and I found it surprisingly hard to manage, and I think it was a real wake-up call for me in terms of what access to care looked like for the vast majority of the population, that actually outside of that quite unusual setup, which is kind of resource unconstrained in elite sport, actually trying to access effective care for musculoskeletal conditions in a system like the NHS is very, very hard. And it's not through lack of effort on the NHS part. It's just a fundamental challenge around the delivery of this sort of care. So we know that patients with conditions like back pain, we need fast access to multidisciplinary care with frequent interventions that's tailored and adapts to our individual progress and all the rest of it. These conditions are so common, as you said in your introduction, that if that care requires sitting in a room or on a phone with a healthcare professional like a physio, it's just not possible to deliver at the scale that it's needed. So Rick, who's my co-founder and the CTO of Flok, we sat down to try and solve that problem, which is, we know this type of care works. How can we build, what would it take to build a system that can deliver that kind of care, so personalized, effective, proven care at the population scale that it's needed? And that's where it really, really began for us, and what we have built to date and what we continue to build.
Okay, great. So let's just rewind a little bit, because it sounds like you've got a very interesting personal backstory here. So, and by the way, when you said you weren't good enough to get into the Olympics, that doesn't sound like an admission of inadequacy to me, because that includes most of us, I think, doesn't it?
Well, I think it was certainly an interesting. I think I learned a lot from the experience. Trying to get to that sort of level. And it is I think the reality of sport is quite a useful lesson. I think outside of sport, we're afraid, or possibly of startups as well, we're afraid of just calling things failure. Actually, failure happens. It is, if you're trying to do something and you don't succeed at doing it, that is a failure. the idea that that has to be a negative thing is not necessarily, I think that's something that we're culturally bad at, and is actually a kind of interesting. I guess it's one of the things that translates out of sport is how you systematically approach trying to achieve something very specific, get
Right.
as good as possible at a very specific goal.
And so, just so that we understand your backstory a little bit better, did you injure your back doing rowing? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so I mean, as not hugely badly, but training it when you're training multiple times a day, over long period of time, you have fairly steady flow of musculoskeletal issues that require a bit of management. Back pain is very common in rowers. We're all 6'7" and have bad posture, so your back, you have an issue with your back, you see the physio the same day. They gives you some stuff to work on. They support you in working on it on a daily basis, and a week later you're racing again. And so, for me, it never really impacted me in that environment, even though I was doing something very physical. And then outside of that environment, when it flared up again, despite having, on paper, being quite well prepared to manage that kind of condition, in practice was surprised by how difficult it was.
And did you find physiotherapy helpful? Not just whilst you were rowing competitively, but afterwards when you had this flare up? Did it work for you?
Yes, yeah. Physiotherapy, I think, is also quite a misunderstood discipline. It's much broader than most people think. It's not just about exercises, or people tend to have this image of the physio is going to give you an elastic band and you're going to kind of stand on a wall and repeat the same thing ad infinitum. Physiotherapy is much broader than that. And musculoskeletal care is a broad multidisciplinary area, the non-physical interventions can be just as important. So education, pain management techniques, psychosocial interventions like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. The evidence is extremely clear that the correct way by far the best way of treating musculoskeletal pain is this kind of multidisciplinary approach where you're looking at the holistic situation with a patient and managing multiple parts of their care. And that's what physiotherapy really is. And certainly is very effective. I think for the vast majority, people with back pain, a very, very small percentage will have something else that is causing the back pain. The vast majority of people have what generally becomes known as, we're talking over 99% will have something that becomes known as non-specific low back pain, which means we're not entirely sure what triggered it, but its continuation is abnormal. And by far the most effective way of dealing with that is this kind of musculoskeletal care, physiotherapy, and sort of multidisciplinary interventions.
I see. Okay, well, we'll get into the details of what the system is that you've developed at Flok Health and how it works. But first of all, why don't you give us a bit of background on Flok Health? Where is it as a company? And maybe could you start off perhaps with just crystallizing exactly what the problem is that you're trying to address here?
Yeah, so I guess the crystallization of the problem we're trying to solve is that there are a cluster of health conditions that cause a disproportionate amount of debilitation at community level. So things like musculoskeletal pain, pelvic health conditions, these areas where the effective treatment is actually very well described and evidenced. You can look at an evidence base and say, if you give people fast access to frequent multidisciplinary care, they will generally do very well. If you don't, there is significant risk of long-term worsening deterioration. You get into kind of the chronic pain realms of where negative spirals. And so the problem we're trying to solve is we know what treatment patients should be getting. There just wasn't a way of delivering that care to the number of people that needed it. And that's what we set out to try and change. So this is fundamentally a delivery model effort. This is not trying to invent a new therapy. A huge amount of effort goes into in other areas of healthcare innovation, into looking at new types of treatment for disease, very complex diseases, new types of surgery, new types of diagnostic. What we're very focused on is delivery models. Our understanding as a healthcare profession industry is already much greater than what we repeatedly deliver to the people that need it. And so we're focused on delivery because we think it's the most effective way of having impact. Take what works and just make sure the people who need it get it.
Okay, so could you describe where you are as a company currently?
Yes, so the company is just over 2 years old. So we founded it in 2022 with this idea of building essentially an automated physiotherapy clinic. So a system that could allow you to have what appears to be a video call with a physiotherapist, but our side of the call is being created on some servers in real time in response to what the patient is saying, doing, reporting, worried about. So very personalized experience, but very scalable. We got, so as you can imagine, this is a heavily regulated space. So our software required regulatory approval as a medical device. The company is also regulated as a healthcare provider because we didn't just want to be a software supplier to healthcare providers who then had to try and apply software that they hadn't built. We wanted to be able to be the provider ourselves, directly deliver care to patients on behalf of our partners. So that means the company, it comes under, in England, the regulation by the Care Quality Commission, which is the independent regulator of health and social care. We got both of those regulatory approvals last year in April, it's just over a year ago, and then subsequently ran deployments in the NHS across 4 large sites where we looked at early performance data for self-referred back pain patients. We ran those trials treating over 1,000 self-referred patients in the clinic and looked at efficiency, access time, the kind of experience and outcome measures that patients reported. And we're now at a point where we've got that early proof data and we're taking that through the procurement stages with our first NHS partners to deliver community musculoskeletal services on their behalf. Which
great.
At the moment is kind of particularly in the spotlight with very large backlogs on these services, and just there is a fundamental kind of supply-demand mismatch with care in these areas.
Okay, good. So imagine that I'm a patient using your system for the first time. What would I see? What would be my experience of using your system?
Yeah, so you might have, for example, phoned your local GP, tried to book an appointment for back pain, and they said, well, we do have an appointment. It's in a few weeks, and then the waiting list for physiotherapy is quite long. Or we now offer a digital service as well. You can see the service today. Which would you like to do? And in this case, I guess you've opted to come via a digital pathway. You would then, so they would essentially register you with us as a provider. So we would then reach out, within literally minutes. We reach out to the patient with instructions for how to access the service. The service is accessed via an app, which is where they do most of their appointments. You download the app, you register, it takes you through onboarding, and then you start your first appointment, which is a triage and assessment appointment with our system. So what you would see is like a structured video call. So it's a video, someone's going to speak to you, they're going to ask you questions, and depending on your answer and all the previous answers you've given, they will say and do different things next in a very responsive, real-time way to give you that kind of tailored care experience. Once you've been assessed,
is this like an avatar that the patient is speaking to, or is it a text box?
It's actually not. So it's based on real footage. So what we're doing is we film lots of very short sequences of a real person in an on-site film studio in our offices. But then what the software is doing is pulling those sequences apart and reassembling a series of frames to get the intended result. So there's a decision engine that's the AI component that is able to decide based on what it's learned so far what should happen next for a given patient, mm-hmm. and then a separate technology component that's then assembling and streaming that video to communicate the decision with the patient. Because making a decision is one thing. You have to have a way of interacting with the patient in a way that allows sufficient clinical nuance, allows demonstration of movement, allows the patient to feel like they're actually having quite a human experience, ironically.
So let's say that I'm presenting to this system with back pain, and I'm guessing there'll be a series of text questions.
So the questions, it's a video call, so they'll ask you questions verbally and give you a constrained set of responses that you can use.
Got it.
So it's not entirely freeform, but it's like a structured video call. We found that to be much more engaging than a text-based interaction, but also there's a lot of a clinical encounter that is quite nuanced. The way you're trying to explain a particular thing, or talk about the significance of how an individual symptom might have progressed. Doing that in written form gets long quite quickly.
Yeah.
You can communicate that nuance much more effectively in our experience with with an interaction model that is verbal with that's video basically. I mean, there's a reason that's how we have how most of these appointments take place in a traditional model. You can just communicate information in both directions more efficiently.
Okay, got it. And then the video clips will be video clips of somebody talking to me, but also I'm guessing maybe video clips of somebody showing me how to do certain exercises or tests.
Yes, yeah. So it's quite, lots of, particularly once you get into the treatment, there's lots of movement assessments, and then you get into exercise prescription, demonstration of particular exercises, but they're not clips in the sense that for you as the user, as the patient, the video stream is one continuous stream that only you will ever see. So the system is stitching together frames, but it's not a playlist, because it wouldn't allow us to cope with the range of possible scenarios.
Yeah.
So the video has to be, it's kind of like laying the track in front of a train, and it's specific to each patient. So it's very unlikely that any two patients will ever see an identical pathway, because their responses will be different. The timing of their responses will be different. How they progress through treatment will be different, and so their treatment will be adjusted differently as a result, as it would be in the ideal traditional clinical environment.
I see. And so is the experience from the point of view of patient continuous, or does it come across as a kind of series of possibly?
It never finishes. So we actually use, so from the device's perspective, this is a video call. So it thinks there's a person. So if you're using your iPhone, for example, to join an appointment, as far as your iPhone's concerned, you're in like a FaceTime call. And the frames never stop being delivered. So it's a single continuous, each appointment is a single continuous stream, but the stream itself is being determined in real time by the underlying decision engine.
Got it. Now, some people might be asking whether this kind of system is, or at least could be, hard-coded as a conventional kind of decision tree. In other words, not really AI at all. Now, could you speak to that?
Yeah, so people have tried to build this kind of system before, particularly for triage, I guess. There are a number of examples of people trying to do digital triage with decision trees. The real challenge with like a static decision tree and why it's never really worked is it's just not sophisticated enough to cover the breadth and depth of a clinical encounter. So I guess to make a system that's based on a static predetermined decision tree, what you have to do is sit down and imagine every possible branch on that tree and write them in a sequence. And even for a relatively short encounter, the number of possible questions that might matter, the number of possible answers that a patient might give, the number of scenarios that you might encounter, you can imagine that it quickly becomes a very, very, very large number of combinations. Drawing that in advance, imagining every possible scenario in advance, even if that were possible, it would become implausible to evaluate, to review, to interrogate that tree for things like regulatory, for example. Even if you could generate it, but I'd argue that you probably can't generate it. So systems that have done this have ended up basically compromising and saying, okay, well, we can't capture the full range of clinical sophistication. Yeah. So what we'll do is coarsely bucket. We may not be able to make nuanced decisions or have nuanced encounters with a patient, but we can do some fairly coarse categorization. We can say, well, this patient probably needs to, be reviewed by someone urgently. This patient probably doesn't, and can wait a bit longer. Those sorts of things are entirely doable with a decision tree. But the problem then is, of course, you're still gated by the availability of clinicians. So you're adding a layer between the patient and the clinician, but your ability to deliver a service at scale would still then be dependent on the availability of clinicians to review the outcome of that. So
Okay.
Then the approach that everyone gets very excited about is obviously LLMs, and this idea of, okay, we could use some kind of generative model to have a much more sophisticated conversation. You can, but the problem is obviously that I think the idea of LLMs and hallucination is now fairly broadly understood. LLMs, it's not a bug to iron out. It's like an intrinsic part of how those approaches work, is that they will be at some frequency very convincingly wrong. And that's fine if what you're asking it for is, advice on, I don't know, what to cook for dinner. It's not fine if it's unsupervised, giving you healthcare advice on a condition that might be serious. You need to be able to, from both a safety perspective, but also in terms of working through medical device regulation, you need to be able to prove that the system will operate in a predictable and safe way all the time, not just most of the time.
Now, I'm sure that millions of people have used large language models to try and give them tips on physiotherapy for self-treating. I'm sure that's happened plenty of times. Have you tried that yourself, and what were the results?
Yeah, I mean, look, it will be, it's sometimes it will be right and sometimes it will be wrong. The problem is, if you know the difference, you didn't need to ask it in the first place. That's which is true broadly for LLMs. You need to know enough to use them effectively. If you want to use an LLM to help you write software, you have to know how to write software. You can't. Yeah. Doesn't mean that anyone can suddenly write software, because you need to understand which bits are wrong, where it's not going to work, which bits you need to change. This kind of thing. So, I guess even if at the moment there's there's no way of really taking an LLM through a regulatory medical device regulatory process to where you can actually then use it to deliver healthcare because of that problem. But that, even if you could get it through regulatory, I'm not sure how you could be confident that it was safe, or that it would be consistently safe. So we took quite a different approach. We developed a new form of domain-specific programming language. So that the theory here is, the output of a system. If the output of a system is decisions, then the types of decision, the types of output that system can generate are fundamentally constrained by the language that they're in. Like, a thing can only express something that the language is capable of expressing. So if you control the language, you control the range of potential outputs. So we sort of took traditional human clinical reasoning, tried to break it down into its constituent components, and translated that into a domain-specific programming language that can describe those types of decisions. And then this gives you kind of an abstraction layer on the decision-making process, where you don't need to be able to know every possible scenario in advance. You just need to know the types of decisions that could be made, the types of answers that are necessary, the types of information that might be required, and over time get a more and more sophisticated system for generating those decisions. So this is, we're now at a point where our automation level is pretty high. So for patients coming through our back pain clinic, 98.5% of them will have a fully automated pathway. Yeah. Our clinicians are reviewing, and so it's not 100%. I'm not sure it ever will be. There are still 1.5% of patients for us where the software is flagging them to our clinical team internally and saying, it just can't be sufficiently sure. And the clinician at that point generally will end up calling that patient to discuss a particular thing that they might have said or done, and then decide whether any modification needs to be made to their treatment, or whether actually, or they maybe need to be seen somewhere else, or they can just, continue with some advice. Sure. But a pretty high level of automation with this approach. So I think, so far it seems to be an approach that captures, allows us to capture a lot more nuance and breadth than something like just a static decision tree, simple decision tree, but doesn't bring you all the challenges of like a black box system where you can't be confident about the ways in which it will behave.
Okay, we'll explore that a little bit more in a minute, but let me just ask you about this. It seems quite remarkable to me to have developed a completely new programming language to develop your system. Did that cause problems for you at the regulatory level? Because I can imagine that a regulator might say something like, we'd much preferred you to have used, I don't know, Python or something that we understand.
The problem, and I guess this is why domain-specific languages are useful. If you take a language like Python, it is intentionally a general-purpose language. You can describe most things. It means that if you have quite a specific application, it's probably less efficient. Ideally, you want the language to do more of the work for you. And if it's a general-purpose language, the work it does is be a general purpose. But it also could express. It would be much harder to constrain the way. You can describe things that you wouldn't necessarily want it to be capable of describing in Python. And by having a domain-specific language that is where features are added to the language at language level, means that you can then be it gives you much higher both confidence and ability to prove to, from a regulatory perspective, that the behavior of the system is what you intend it to be, and makes that provable, which is I guess the key point. From a regulatory perspective, we also had to build a lot of adjacent systems as part of proving that continues to be true. So, for example, one of the things, so I guess from a clinical risk perspective, the triage decision, is a major piece for us. This is a self-referred patient where we may be their only contact with the healthcare system for their condition. There are some very rare conditions that are very serious that present as back pain. We need to be confident that patients coming through the clinic and receiving treatment, don't have those, and that if they have, red flag symptoms, if they have concerning presentations, that they're sent urgently to the correct care service to manage those conditions. To test. So it's one thing, you can build in you can show that your system, meets all the clinical guidelines, things like NICE, the NHS England's Calder-Equina, GIRFT threshold, the national back pain pathway, these sorts of things. But then being able to prove that it continues to do that. We built a system that every night generates several thousand synthetic patients and sends them through that clinic process, so that we can check for any unintended or unexpected behavior. So it's not just making the thing. I guess that's the broader point around regulatory. It's not just making something that is safe and does work. It's also making or doing all the things that allow you to show that that's true in a way that is comprehensible.
Okay, all right. So that brings us very nicely onto the question of evidence then. Now, obviously, if I'm a local authority and I'm thinking about whether to deploy your kind of system, I want to be convinced that it actually works and that it doesn't have safety issues. So could you speak to that? Maybe talk about what kind of comparisons might you do? Like, for example, it's difficult, I would imagine, to compare efficacy and safety to human physiotherapists in a simple way. But how would your presentation of that evidence go?
It is difficult to do a like-for-like comparison because they're not like-for-like delivery models, but it's certainly not impossible. So, and I guess and maybe if I can split out kind of safety and then performance, because I think the demonstration is probably different for them. So on the safety side, a lot of the safety evidence comes from the regulatory process. So how it's been proven that various things are true. And that's the regulatory on the software side for medical device, but also from the company perspective, being a CQC regulated healthcare provider means that you have the CQC are the same regulator that regulate NHS trusts, for example. So you're subject to those governance requirements in terms of the processes you have in place, the way you manage risk, the way you monitor risk and incidents and respond to them. So I think those, that's why regulation in healthcare is so important, is that it gives that level of assurance to someone in a trust MSK service who may not have the domain specific. Once you're into kind of medical device software, for example, they may not have the depth of knowledge on that. But then that's why having independent, I guess like national level regulation is so important. In terms of looking at, how does it compare? Well, we use, and this is becoming increasingly common like all forms of MSK and healthcare delivery in general, but PROMs and PREMs, so patient-reported outcome measures, patient-reported experience measures. And this is kind of the idea that, really the patient, it's being more patient-centric about how we think about care and, what patients want, and offering, choice, putting them at the heart of the decision-making process, so more shared decision-making rather than a system that decides for a patient and tells them. So we ask a collection of PROMs and PREMs metrics throughout the pathway, including at discharge, that allow us to have targets around both how well the system works from a symptom improvement perspective, but also really important things like what proportion of patients feel that their confidence in self-managing in the future has increased. And on the experience side, which I think was one of your specific questions, we ask patients how their experience has compared to what they've had before or would expect to have in a human physiotherapy model. And actually, we get over half saying they thought it was a better experience, which has been really interesting. And this is obviously part to do with access. So, if your status quo is that it takes 4 months to get an appointment, which is not uncommon at the moment for NHS physiotherapy, they're just really, really overburdened with the level of demand, very, very large backlogs. And then when you see that service, you probably can only have 1, maybe 2 appointments. So you waited quite a long time, and then the system is it's so resource constrained relative to demand that it can't give you necessarily the extent of care that you might be looking for. This, our approach and adding this like significant automation leverage clearly changes that. So we do not operate a wait list. Everyone gets same day access to care, which immediately is a pretty positive thing from a patient perspective. You've gone out, you've sought care, you've said, well, enough is enough. I need to do something about my back. I'd like someone to help me with it. Being able to get that help, on the day is pretty important. But it also means the extent of care that we can deliver. So typically our patients will have, a weekly appointment, which is one of these video calls with their digital physio, which will allow them to review the progress from the previous week, look at new interventions, look at intervention adjustments based on how they found various things. That kind of depth and breadth of care is just so hard to do. It's just so hard to deliver at scale, because you'd need some ridiculous proportion of the population to retrain as a physio, basically. Which just is we have difficulty filling. We need more physios as it is, let alone if we wanted to be able to provide this kind of care pathway with no waiting list. So I think we've found patients have been really very positive. I think there is an effect. We talked about LLMs earlier. There's definitely a cultural shift, probably driven by the products coming out of OpenAI, where interacting with an autonomous software system has gone from being something that feels pretty niche and something that most people in the population probably aren't doing. It's gone to something that's actually very mainstream. The number of people who have now, if you said, well, if you're interacted with an AI system that's like gives you can like give you answers to questions, or is automated, they'll be like, oh yeah, of course. Who hasn't? That's really shifted how people think about autonomous systems, and I think there's a nice kind of timing. There's a timing piece for us around that. I think culturally, people have been much more embracing of this idea than perhaps they would have been a few years ago, both on the patient side, but also on the kind of provider, government type policy side.
Okay, but in terms of all that's understood, in terms, however, of safety, let me just press you a little bit.
Yeah.
If a local authority wanted really hard data and were somewhat skeptical, really needed to be convinced about the safety of this kind of system, how would you address that?
Yeah, so I think we talked them through. Clearly, part of every time we've done a deployment with a trust or a health board, we spend a lot of time on this as part of the governance process. End up with a joint governance process with the organisation, talking through how this works. We can prove how the benefit of this kind of system is. You can prove the consistency of results. So all of the guidelines, so the national level guidelines, but also the local referral criteria get added as configuration, and then you can do lots and lots of testing and show that those are consistently working. The patient that should be sent to the emergency department, for example, is being sent to the emergency department. But again, there is also then just continuous monitoring. So, for example, we have like a safety monitor. It's like an independent piece of watchdog software that has a much simpler set of rules that it's trained on. So they're really like safety critical rules, and it observes the behavior of the core service and makes sure that if it ever does something that contravenes one of those rules, the safety system has precedence and will overrule it, will step in. So there are multiple layers of safety around it. But I think actually, the reality is in lots of ways, one of the things that's very hard about safely delivering MSK care at scale is that it's very difficult to consistently get guideline adherence. Guidelines exist, and there's great work being done by organizations like GERFT in the NHS, where significant work goes into determining what is the best, what is the correct way of managing a presentation where you suspect neurology as part of the back pain presentation. Huge amount of work goes into that. It is very, very hard and takes a long time to get that adopted at scale and consistently applied in a traditional clinical environment. It's behavior change, one clinician at a time across literally tens of thousands of clinicians. One of the benefits of an autonomous system is that a new guideline can come out saying, actually, we've done a huge piece of research, realized that this kind of pattern is really important for predicting this, and we can make sure that our system then implements that 100% of the time. In a very basically won't necessarily be overnight, but as much closer to overnight than you would get in a traditional model of care. So I think actually in lots of ways it's easier to both demonstrate and ensure quality and safety in an automated system than it is in the kind of messy reality of
yes,
practice.
Right. That's a very interesting observation. So during the process of interacting with the system, is feedback on pain, for example, invited so that you might flag up potential problems?
Yes, yeah.
Right.
So the patient continually inputs into the system. So so for example, it might talk them through a movement assessment, demonstrate it, get them to say, where did they feel, what did they feel, where was it, did they feel pain down their leg at the same time? The sorts of questions you'd get asked if a physio was assessing you in a regular clinic. And everything it does will respond to that. So, if it gives you an exercise to do and you try it and you actually just find it a little bit, maybe you're confused and you need it to be explained a different way. Maybe it's too hard for you and you need a modification. It will do all of those things for you in real time.
All right. So let's talk. We've talked a bit about challenges, but let's drill down a little bit more. Firstly, you mentioned that there's no I think you said that there's no black box type problem with this kind of system. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think one of the advantages of the kind of language-based approach we've taken to automation is that the system is both entirely predictable and observable. So I guess the challenge of a black box type system is you've exposed it to a large volume of training data. It has deduced certain things of which you aren't sure exactly what they might be, and then you expose it to some new things, and it will react based on the things it observed from training data. I guess broadly is how this sort of typical kind of black box, I guess that's what people generally mean when they talk about black box. And that means you may not, you both might get unwanted behavior or you might get very unexpected behavior because the pattern it's picked up on is one that is not relevant and might be harmful, for example. So language-based approach means that there is no mystery. It's not hidden. It's not it will always respond the same way to the same input for reasons that are describable and mathematically provable. So there isn't a black box problem. The system can be fully interrogated. It transcribes its reasoning. So we have a health record for every patient that comes through our clinic. Every encounter they have with the system it ends up with a transcript of the conversation that's been had and a record of what decisions were made and why they were taken. So it's not just the way it makes decisions, it's also that facilitates like recording and auditing decisions in a way that's just not possible with something that's a kind of black box. And that's hugely important, obviously, for kind of governance and safety. You need, this, if you've got a system where, okay, your clinician, one of your clinicians now wants to review a patient, and if there's no way of them knowing what the patient, what the system has advised the patient and why, and what the patient said, it's it's kind of impossible for that clinician to do their job at that point. Whereas when they look at a record with our system, that record could have been written by another person, basically. So they're able to understand the context, understand where the patient is in the pathway, why they're at that point, and then if they need to make a change, they can do so.
Now, there may be physiotherapists out there, Finn, who are thinking, what do you mean most people prefer this to us? It's an outrageous idea. No. So my question is, how has this been received in general by different sectors of the people who you interact with?
Yeah, and I mean, look, maybe I'll start with a caveat on the preference level. I mean, this is a deliberately, the point of this. We are not here to replace traditional physiotherapy. We're here to work in partnership so that it expands patient choice and everyone benefits. So patients who access our service get it much faster than they would in a traditional model. But the patients who still want to see a physio in person can also now see a physio faster because that system is not having to deal with the same level of strain as it was. So this is about patient choice. We're not advocating that this is forced upon patients. This is intended. We know that a pretty significant proportion of patients choose this approach when given the option. We will always work in partnership with traditional providers because we'll never cover the full range, breadth, depth of conditions, encounter types, patient populations that are necessary to deliver care to a full population. Our role, our value that we bring is to, deliver very efficiently, very scalably, the sort of a whole chunk of the high volume, more routine care pathways, where actually that patient isn't going to benefit from, they don't need to be in a room with a physio. They're actually they're going to benefit far more from just getting that really tailored, interactive, individualized help sooner and more frequently. So that preference level, this is presented as a choice to patients, which means, of course, that they're a self-selecting population. So there'll be some patients who don't want this, and that is absolutely, that is great. That will always be true. There are a bunch of patients who do want it, which means they're kind of self-selecting and tend to be pretty positive.
All of that sounds very, very reasonable.
Yeah.
How's that reasonable?
How do physios respond?
Yeah.
So what? Generally very positive. So I think particularly, I think there's so much hype around AI and this like, in my view, misplaced fear of it's going to replace jobs. This is a sort of binary. You can either have X or Y, or you won't have both. I don't think that's ever true. Certainly in the field that we work, we're not going to be replacing the demand supply mismatch is so great that we could have huge proportions of patients managed by autonomous systems like this and still keep all the physios extremely busy. And actually the key here is this is a huge chunk of this is about making their lives as a clinician better. None of us went into healthcare wanting to, work in a service where we couldn't see a patient for months after they sought help, and then were under such pressure to see, X patients a day that we were only able to see that patient for, 10 minutes, which is basically enough time to ask a few questions and give some generic advice. That's not really why most clinicians have gone into healthcare in the first place. And I think, when we've interacted with, physios in the services that we work with and have worked with, once we have that discussion and it becomes really clear that we're here as a partner, actually to mean that they have, they can see patients faster too, they can have more time with patients, they're able to have the sort of level of follow-up that they would want clinically for the patients that need it. I think they see this as a really positive direction for the profession.
Okay, great. Okay, last area I'd like to explore, Finn, is this question of specificity. Now,
Mm-hmm.
clearly, there's nothing special about physio in this context, in the sense that this principle could be applied to all sorts of medicine. So my question is, how do you see that? Are you looking to expand the applications for this kind of system? What would that look like? How would that change the current status quo?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's yeah, you're absolutely correct. So I would say it doesn't apply to all of medicine. So there's a huge amount of medicine where there's something in the delivery of that pathway that just means you can't take the whole thing and do it digitally. You either need kind of, whether that's basically, some form of invasive treatment, for example. But there are a huge number of healthcare interactions that are very suitable for this sort of delivery model. And you're right, we've started with back pain and MSK because it's just such a big, debilitating area with such huge socioeconomic consequence that it was just a big problem to run at. But the underlying technology is fundamentally a much more generalizable approach to regulated decision automation. I guess it is really what we have built. It's a form of decision automation that can safely operate in a regulated environment, and we will over time be expanding that into other clinical verticals. So both on the triage and treatment side, starting to assess broader range of patients, but also treat a broader range of patients with clinics at kind of very significant levels of automation. And our focus there is on areas where speed and frequency of access are important, where multidisciplinary care is important, and where the conditions are extremely common, and therefore there's very high demand for care. So there's none of the areas we're interested in, I suspect, will come as a surprise to people. It's areas like pelvic health, it's areas like hip and knee osteoarthritis, and broadly, clinical applications where getting the right care to people fast at scale, where that care is non-invasive, is the best predictor of outcomes. And that's a pretty, if you sit down and think about the list, it's a pretty long list where that would make a huge difference. So I think we're unlikely to ever be finished in terms of the applicability of this kind of approach. Yeah.
Okay, so could you just very briefly explain what the competitive landscape looks like to you, either in MSK or more broadly?
Yeah, so I guess it depends what you consider, to be a competitor. So we're far from the first company to realize that digital technology should be adding much more leverage in MSK delivery than it is. There's a bunch of digital MSK out there. To date, it really sits in one of two categories. Either it's very basic, like adjunct, so it's kind of saying, well, leaflets are useful. We should make an app that's like a digital form of a leaflet, and it will help. Like, you'll still need to see a physio, but rather than write your exercises down, they can give you them in an app, and you can like that might be better. It's a kind of quality improvement to the existing pathway, which is has been quite effective, but is fundamentally doesn't change the like the bottleneck on care delivery, which is clinician availability. The other category is basically to do more, closer to the sort of delivery we do, which is like full pathway. So actually deliver the full pathway with digital leverage, but with still a significant one-to-one clinician reliance. So you see this particularly in the US, the big companies in this space, where their focus is corporate health plans, and they are digital pathways, but with huge human input. Like whole call centers of health coaches calling people every week to encourage them, help them with their exercise, answer questions. And that works very well, obviously, in the market that it's serving, but is just not. It's still gated by humans. It still depends on human delivery, and that is just not that level of resource allocation is just not viable in kind of European public healthcare systems, for example, where we're much more cost constrained. So I think from our perspective, the part of our approach that is more unique is building end-to-end pathway delivery. So kind of fully operational, clinic services, but where the level of human in loop is very, very low. And therefore, the kind of scale that we can provide it at, the kind of cost that we can provide it at is literally, orders of magnitude different from what those like much more human pathways look like.
Well, Finn, to me, it's an absolutely classic example of medical AI, and so I wish the absolute best of luck with Flok Health. So it's been a really fascinating discussion. Last question, Finn. That's a question that I always ask, and that is, do you have an example of a medical AI system which is, to you, your favourite and has got nothing to do with this area?
Interesting question. I think an area that I find very interesting and where I think exciting progress has been made, but will continue to be made, is, so obviously everyone gets excited around imaging and AI, and it's like a classic pattern match challenge. AI is very good at that. I guess within that, though, I think generally people are thinking CTs, MRIs, etc. I think the sort of AI and ultrasound, like particularly point of care ultrasound, is an area that I think is interesting, and we'll see continued advances. So there's companies, I guess, like Butterfly Network is probably the biggest one, I think, in the space. But that sort of ultrasound imaging is a really neat problem for an AI system. It's also being able to do like really high quality point of care ultrasound as a clinician, can have a very significant impact on clinical accuracy and quality quite fast. And something that makes this it's maybe not the most insane application, but it's actually can make quite a huge difference in frontline clinical practice if you make that significantly more accessible and more scalable.
Fantastic. Great example. Finn, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. So thank you so much. Best of luck. And sometime in the future, come back and tell us how it's going.
Will do. Thanks very much for having me.
Brilliant. Cheers, Finn. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Medical AI Podcast. We are Felix Beecher and Joe McKeating. Ping us on LinkedIn if you have any ideas on new guests. See you next time.